close your eyes now, and let yourself settle in. Tonight, we're traveling back, not to castles or crowded cities, but to the wide, silent plains of North America, where winter descended like a quiet hand, and temperatures dropped to 30 degrees below zero. Imagine standing beneath an enormous sky, where the stars seem closer than they should be, and the air is so cold it stings your lungs with every breath. And yet, people lived here. Thrived here. In structures made of hide and wooden poles, the tipi, they found warmth, safety, and home. Tonight, we'll step inside that warmth, and discover slowly, gently, how it was done. So breathe deeply, let the cold night air wash over you, and follow me into the story. The tipi was not just a tent. It was a carefully engineered piece of architecture, born from generations of observation, trial, and deep understanding of wind, fire, and cold. Picture it now, rising from the snow-dusted ground like a cone of softly glowing amber. 15, sometimes 20 feet tall. A skeleton of long wooden poles, leaning inward at just the right angle, meeting at a peak high above. The poles themselves were chosen with care. Lodgepole pine, often, light enough to move, strong enough to bear the weight of heavy hides and winter storms. They were gathered in late summer, stripped of bark, allowed to cure in the sun. When it was time to raise the tipi, the poles were arranged in a tripod at the base, lashed together with rawhide thongs that tightened as they dried. Then more poles were added, one by one, leaning into the frame, creating a circular foundation. And then came the cover. Bison hides, 10, 15, sometimes more, stitched together with sinew thread. The women who made these covers were artists and engineers both. Every stitch mattered. Every seam had to be tight against wind and snow. The hides were sewn in summer, stretched and softened and smoked over low fires until they became supple and strong. By winter, they had hardened just enough to hold their shape, but remained flexible enough to tie snugly around the poles. The cover wrapped around the tipi frame like a second skin. At the base, it was pegged into the earth with wooden stakes, or weighted with stones. At the top, two adjustable flaps called ears were left open, allowing smoke to escape from the fire within. These ears could be moved with long poles from outside the tipi, angled to catch the wind or block the snow, directing airflow with a subtlety that would impress modern engineers. Inside, the floor was not bare earth. First came a layer of dried grasses, then softened hides, then woven mats or furs. The bedding was piled thick near the edges, where the cold seeped in most. The center was left open, reserved for the fire. And everything, was arranged in a circle. Because the tipi was round, wind could not catch a corner and tear it apart. Snow slid down the steep sides instead of piling up and collapsing the roof. Heat from the fire rose evenly, circulating along the curved walls, returning downward in a slow, steady current. The people who lived in these homes understood something profound, that survival in the coldest places required not brute force, but harmony with the shape of the world. And so the tipi stood, patient and warm, a small island of light on the frozen plain. Outside, the wind whispered through the grasses, and the stars turned slowly overhead, and inside, the fire crackled softly, steady as a heartbeat. But the tipi's true genius lay just beneath the surface. If you had stepped inside on a winter night, your eyes adjusting to the amber glow of firelight, you might have noticed something unusual. A second wall. Not outside, but inside. This was the dew cloth, and it was the quiet hero of winter survival. Imagine a tall curtain, made from the same tanned hides as the outer cover, but lighter, softer. It hung from the poles about 5 or 6 feet up from the ground, suspended on a framework of thin sticks or cord, and it draped inward, creating a kind of inner room. This lining did not touch the outer wall. Instead, it left a gap of several inches between the two layers, an empty space that seemed like nothing, but was, in fact, everything. That gap was an insulation layer. Cold air from outside pressed against the bison hide cover, but it could not pass easily through the space between the walls. Meanwhile, warm air from the fire rose upward along the inner surface of the dew cloth, then slipped into that gap and traveled downward along the outer wall, creating a circulation of warmth. It was a convection system, built without machines or mathematics, only observation and intuition. The dew cloth also had another purpose. In the deep cold of winter, when warm, moist air from cooking and breathing met the frozen outer wall, condensation would form. Tiny beads of moisture that could freeze into ice or drip down onto bedding and belongings. But the dew cloth caught that moisture first. It absorbed the droplets, or channeled them downward toward the base of the tipi, where they could be swept away or allowed to freeze harmlessly at the edge. The inner living space remained dry. And so the people slept, wrapped in furs and blankets, pressed close to one another for warmth, but never damp, never chilled by ice forming on the walls above them. The dew cloth was often decorated, painted with geometric designs, or scenes of hunts and sacred stories. These paintings were not just art, they were records, teachings, prayers. A family's dew cloth might show the history of their lineage, or symbols of protection and gratitude. At night, by firelight, those painted images seemed to move. Shadows danced across the hides. The buffalo painted there seemed to walk again. Children grew up watching those walls, learning their people's stories before they could even speak. The dew cloth also helped to block drafts. Even with the outer cover staked and weighted, wind could find its way in near the ground. But the inner lining hung lower, overlapping the floor space, creating a seal that kept the coldest air out. Some families also placed bundles of dried grasses or soft moss between the two layers at the base, adding even more insulation where it was needed most. Everything was intentional. Nothing wasted. And when morning came, and the fire had burned low, the dew cloth would still be faintly warm to the touch, holding the heat of the night like a memory. Outside, the sun would begin to climb, pale and distant in the winter sky, and the tipi would exhale a thin curl of smoke from its peak, rising straight and calm into the frozen air. Inside, someone would stir the coals, add a few more sticks, and the fire would return, soft and steady once more. The fire was not just light. It was the center of everything, the living, breathing heart of the tipi. And it had to be tended with great care. Imagine kneeling beside it now, your hands outstretched toward the warmth, feeling the heat soak into your palms and wrists. The flames are small, no roaring blaze, just a steady, glowing bed of coals with occasional flickers of yellow and orange. This was intentional. A large, wild fire would consume too much wood, fill the tipi with smoke, and create dangerous heat that could scorch hides or ignite bedding. Instead, the fire was kept low and controlled, fed slowly throughout the day and night. The wood itself was chosen carefully. In the plains, trees were scarce. Cottonwood, willow, and small hardwoods grew near rivers and streams, and families gathered deadwood throughout the warmer months, stacking it in sheltered places to dry. By winter, that wood had cured, ready to burn long and clean. Dried bison dung, often called buffalo chips, was also used as fuel. It burned slowly and steadily, giving off a mild, earthy warmth with very little smoke. Children were often tasked with gathering these chips in late autumn, piling them near the tipi entrance for easy access. The fire pit itself was shallow, scooped out just a few inches below ground level, and ringed with stones to contain the heat and protect the floor from scorching. Above the fire, a tripod of green sticks might be set up, from which a pot or kettle could hang. Stews simmered there for hours, filling the tipi with the scent of meat, wild onions, and herbs. But the fire did more than cook. It regulated humidity. As snow melted on outer garments or moisture entered through the smoke flaps, the fire's warmth dried the air gently, preventing mold and rot. It also provided light. extending the day long after the sun had set. By firelight, tools were repaired, clothing mended, stories told. And smoke, though often thought of as a nuisance, was actually useful. It rose naturally through the open smoke flaps at the top of the teepee, carrying moisture and stale air with it. The hides of the teepee walls absorbed some of the smoke as well, which helped to preserve them, keeping insects away and making the material more water-resistant. The people who lived in teepees learned to read smoke the way sailors read wind. If the smoke hung low and thick, the ears needed adjusting. If it poured out cleanly through the top, the airflow was balanced. On still nights, when no wind moved the flaps, a family might crack the door cover slightly, allowing fresh air to enter low while smoke escaped high. And always, someone was responsible for the fire. Often the eldest woman of the household, or a young person learning responsibility. The fire could not be allowed to die completely in winter. Even if the family left the teepee for the day, coals were banked carefully under ash, kept alive until evening when they could be revived with breath and kindling. At night, before sleep, the fire was fed one last time. A few thick pieces of wood were placed carefully on the coals, positioned to burn slowly through the darkest hours. Then blankets were pulled close, bodies huddled together, and the teepee filled with the soft sounds of breathing. Outside, the temperature might drop to 30 below. Inside, the fire glowed. Not hot, but warm. Steady. Alive. And as you drifted toward sleep, you could hear it, the faint whisper of flames, the occasional pop of sap in the wood, and beneath it all, the deep, silent cold of the winter night, held at bay by nothing more than hides, smoke, and care. The fire burned on, patient as the stars. When the fire dimmed to embers, and the night deepened, warmth came from another source. Bedding. But not the thin blankets or single quilts we might imagine today. No. The people of the teepee understood that survival in extreme cold required layers, and more layers, and then a few more still. Picture the sleeping area now. It was arranged along the back and sides of the teepee, farthest from the door where drafts might enter. The coldest air always settled low, so the first layer on the ground was crucial. Dried prairie grasses were spread thick, a cushion of insulation between sleeper and frozen earth. These grasses were gathered in autumn, bundled and stored, then laid down in armfuls until the floor was soft and springy underfoot. On top of the grasses came hides. Buffalo robes, most often, tanned with the fur still on. These were not small pelts. A single buffalo hide could measure 6 feet across or more, heavy, dense, luxurious in its warmth. Several of these were layered one atop the other, fur side up, creating a bed that felt almost alive with softness. Some families also used deer, elk, or antelope hides, lighter and more flexible, stitched together into large sleeping mats. And then came the blankets. Woven from plant fibers in some regions, or made from smaller animal pelts sewn together in others. Later, after trade with Europeans began, wool blankets became treasured possessions, but long before that, the people made do with what the land provided. And they were warm. Because warmth, in the teepee, was not just about materials. It was about bodies. Families slept close together. Parents, children, elders, all nestled side by side beneath shared robes. Infants were wrapped snugly in soft hides or cradled against a mother's chest. Older children curled into the warmth of siblings. This was not only practical, it was essential. Human bodies generate heat constantly, and when pressed together under layers of fur and hide, that heat was trapped and multiplied. A single person sleeping alone might struggle to stay warm, but a family of 5 or 6, huddled together, created a pocket of warmth that could withstand even the cruelest night. Dogs, too, often slept inside the teepee. Not as pets in the modern sense, but as companions and workers. They pulled travois during moves, guarded the camp, and in winter, they added their warmth to the pile of sleeping bodies. There's a reason the phrase, three-dog night, exists, a night so cold you needed 3 dogs pressed against you to survive. Clothing also played a role. People did not undress completely for sleep. Instead, they wore soft inner garments made from tanned hides or woven fibers, lightweight but insulating. Over this, in the coldest nights, they might add another layer of fur or wrap themselves in individual robes before slipping under the communal blankets. The tipi itself helped too. Because the fire burned through the night, however low, it radiated warmth upward. That warmth circulated along the curved walls, then descended slowly, creating a gentle current of warmer air that settled over the sleeping area. And remember the dew cloth, that inner lining we spoke of earlier. It trapped another layer of warmth close to the living space, like a cocoon within a cocoon. So even as the wind howled outside, and frost crept across the outer hides, the interior of the tipi remained a sanctuary. Not hot. Not even particularly warm by modern standards. But enough. Enough to sleep. Enough to dream. Enough to wake again when morning light filtered through the smoke hole above. Children grew up knowing this warmth. They learned to burrow deep into the furs, to press their cold feet against the siblings' back, to listen to the soft breathing of their family all around them. They learned that survival was not a solitary act. It was shared warmth, shared breath, shared life. And so the night passed. Outside, the stars wheeled slowly overhead, and the temperature dropped lower still, so cold that trees cracked like gunshots in the dark. But inside the tipi, beneath layers of hide and fur, surrounded by family and firelight and the faint scent of smoke and earth, there was only warmth. And the slow, steady pull of sleep. You might wonder, in a space so carefully sealed against the cold, how did people breathe? How did the air stay fresh, when smoke rose from the fire, and a dozen lungs drew oxygen from the same small room? The answer lies in something invisible, something as essential as warmth itself. Ventilation. The tipi was not airtight. It was not meant to be. Instead, it was designed to breathe. Let's start at the top, where the smoke hole opened to the sky. This was not a simple gap. It was a carefully shaped opening, controlled by those 2 adjustable flaps we mentioned earlier, the ears of the tipi. These ears were attached to long poles that extended down the outside of the structure, and they could be moved from the ground, angled to catch the wind or block falling snow. When positioned correctly, the ears created a kind of chimney effect. Wind striking the tipi would flow over the smoke hole, creating a low-pressure zone that pulled smoke and stale air upward and out. Even on calm nights, the natural rise of warm air ensured a steady draft. But the smoke hole alone was not enough. Fresh air had to enter, and it did, low and slow, through several small gaps intentionally left in the design. At the base of the tipi, where the cover met the ground, there was always a slight gap. Not large, just an inch or 2, enough to let cold, fresh air seep inward along the floor. This might seem counterintuitive, letting cold air in when you're trying to stay warm. But it was essential. That cold air was heavier than the warm air near the fire. It stayed low, creeping along the floor in a thin layer, and as it warmed, it rose toward the center of the tipi, joining the circulation that carried smoke upward and out. This created a constant, gentle exchange. Stale air and smoke flowed out the top. Fresh air entered at the bottom. The fire, burning steadily in the center, acted as the engine of this system, pulling oxygen in, heating it, and sending it upward. The door cover also played a role. It was usually made from a slightly heavier hide, laced or tied shut from the inside. But it was not sealed completely. Small gaps at the edges allowed additional airflow when needed, and on warmer winter days, the cover could be cracked open slightly to let in more fresh air and light. The people who lived in tipis understood this balance instinctively. They knew when the air inside felt too close, too thick with smoke or breath. They knew when to adjust the ears, when to lift the door cover, when to add a stick to the fire to increase the draft. It was not science in the formal sense, but it was knowledge, deep and embodied, passed down through generations. And it worked. Even in the coldest nights, when the teepee was packed with people and the fire burned low, the air inside remained breathable. You would wake with clear lungs, not choking on smoke or gasping for oxygen. The smoke itself, though ever present, was surprisingly mild. Because the fire was small and the wood dry, the smoke was thin and clean. Most of it rose directly through the smoke hole. What little remained inside was absorbed by the hides, or dispersed in the air currents, never accumulating to dangerous levels. In fact, that faint smell of smoke became part of the teepee's identity. It clung to clothing and bedding, a scent of safety and home. Even today, people who grew up in traditional teepees speak of that smell with nostalgia, the way others might remember the scent of bread baking or rain on summer soil. The teepee breathed. It inhaled cold, fresh air from the world outside. It exhaled warmth and smoke and the scent of living. It was not a sealed box, but a living membrane, constantly exchanging with the environment while protecting those inside. And so the air stayed clear. And the people slept, breathing deeply, their chests rising and falling in rhythm with one another, while outside the wind moved over the plains like a river of cold, and the smoke from 100 teepees rose into the night sky, pale and thin against the stars. Inside, the fire whispered. And the teepee breathed. Hunger, in winter, was a constant companion. Not starvation, not for those who had prepared well, but a steady, gnawing need for fuel. The body burned calories simply to stay warm, and the cold demanded more food than any other season. Inside the teepee, cooking was both necessity and ritual. Picture the pot now, hanging from its tripod over the fire. It might be made from clay, or later, from traded metal. Inside, a stew simmers slowly, meat and fat and whatever roots or dried berries could be spared. The base of almost every winter meal was meat. Bison, primarily, hunted in late autumn and prepared for storage. The people wasted nothing. Meat was sliced thin and dried in the sun and wind, becoming jerky that could last for months. Fat was rendered into tallow, a precious source of calories. Organ meats were eaten fresh or dried. Bones were cracked open for marrow, or boiled for hours to extract every bit of nutrition. Pemmican was the ultimate winter food. Dried meat pounded into powder, mixed with melted fat, and sometimes berries or nuts, then pressed into cakes or pouches. It was dense, portable, and incredibly calorie-rich. A small piece could sustain a person through a long day. But it was not meant to be delicious. Pemmican was survival food, practical and efficient. The real pleasure came from the stews. Into that pot over the fire, someone would place chunks of dried meat, a handful of prairie turnips or wild onions dug before the ground froze, perhaps some dried chokecherries or rose hips for a touch of sweetness. Water was added, often melted from snow, and the whole mixture was left to simmer for hours. The smell would fill the teepee. Rich, savory, earthy. It spoke of warmth and sustenance and patience. Children would hover near the fire, hoping for an early taste. Elders would nod approvingly as the scent deepened. Cooking was a slow process, but that was part of its value. The fire that cooked the food also warmed the home. The time spent preparing the meal was time spent together, talking, mending, telling stories. Nothing was rushed. And when the stew was finally ready, it was shared. Not in individual portions measured and divided, but communally. A large bowl or wooden dish was passed around, and each person took what they needed. There was trust in this, trust that everyone would take only their fair share, trust that there would be enough. Sometimes there wasn't. Winter could be lean. Supplies ran low. Hunts failed. Storms kept people inside for days or weeks. In those times, portions grew smaller. The stew became thinner. Meals were stretched with more water, more roots, less meat. But still, the pot hung over the fire. And still, it was shared. Because the act of eating together, of gathering around the warmth and the food, was as important as the food itself. It was a reminder that they were not alone. That they would endure. Drinks, too, were important. Tea made from wild plants, mint, sage, pine needles. These were not just beverages, they were medicine. Pine needle tea, for instance, provided vitamin C, crucial in winter when fresh greens were unavailable. Water was melted from snow, brought inside in containers and set near the fire to thaw. Drinking enough water in winter was difficult, the cold suppressed thirst, but it was essential. Dehydration could kill as surely as freezing. Some families also made soups from bones. After the meat was eaten, the bones were boiled again and again, each time releasing a little more marrow, a little more flavor, a little more sustenance. The final broth was pale and thin, but warm, and warmth was its own kind of nourishment. Children learned early to appreciate every bite. Nothing was wasted. Scraps were saved for dogs. Bones were used until they crumbled. Even the fat skimmed from the top of a stew was collected and saved, to be used later for cooking or waterproofing or fire starting. And so the tipi was always filled with the scent of food. Even when the pot was empty, the memory of it lingered in the smoke-darkened hides, in the air, in the warmth that rose from the fire. Outside, the world was frozen and silent. Inside, there was the soft scrape of a wooden spoon against clay, the murmur of voices, the crackle of the fire. And somewhere, in the back of the tipi, someone would be dreaming already, lulled by the warmth and the scent of food and the knowledge that tomorrow, the pot would simmer again. To step outside the tipi in winter was to confront a cold so absolute it seemed almost alive. The wind did not simply blow, it cut. The air did not simply chill, it burned. And so the people wrapped themselves in layers. Not the thin coats and gloves we might think of today, but carefully constructed garments made from the hides and furs of animals, each piece designed not just to cover, but to insulate, protect, and preserve life. Start with the innermost layer. Against the skin, soft, tanned hides. Deer or antelope, thin and supple, worn with the smooth side inward. These garments were not stiff or heavy. They moved with the body, allowed sweat to evaporate, and provided a first barrier against the cold. Over this, a second layer of hide or fur. Often buffalo, worn with the fur facing inward this time, so that warmth was trapped against the body. The hide side faced outward, providing a windbreak. This was the principle, layers with air gaps between them. Air is one of the best insulators, and the space between layers trapped pockets of warm air that acted like invisible padding. Leggings were essential. Made from two separate pieces of hide, each tied around the waist and extending down to cover the legs individually. They were laced or tied at the sides, and tucked into moccasins at the bottom. This design allowed for movement, for riding, walking, kneeling, without the restriction of a single sewn garment. Moccasins themselves were marvels of practicality. Made from soft hide, often elk or deer, they fit snugly around the foot like a second skin. But in winter, they were lined with fur or stuffed with dried grasses for insulation. The soles were sometimes doubled or tripled, layers of tough hide stitched together to protect against frozen ground and sharp ice. And over the moccasins, in the deepest cold, some people wore additional hide coverings that extended up the calf, like primitive boots. The torso was protected by a shirt or tunic. Again, layered. A lighter inner shirt and a heavier outer one, often made from buffalo hide with the fur turned inward. The outer shirt was longer, hanging down to mid-thigh, providing extra coverage. Sleeves were long and sometimes extended past the hands, creating built-in mittens that could be folded back when fine hand work was needed. And then came the robe. This was the final, outermost layer, and it was perhaps the most important. A buffalo robe was enormous, heavy, nearly impossible to describe if you've never held one. The hide alone could weigh 20 or 30 pounds, and with the thick winter fur intact, it became a wearable shelter. The robe was worn draped over the shoulders and wrapped around the body, secured with a belt or simply held closed with one hand. It covered from neck to ankle, and when the wind howled, you could pull it over your head like a hood. Beneath that robe, you carried your own warmth. The fur trapped air heated by your body. The weight of the hide blocked wind. And the sheer size of it meant you could wrap yourself completely, disappearing into the folds. Some robes were painted or decorated. Not for vanity, though beauty was valued, but as markers of identity, family, and story. A robe might show symbols of a hunt, a vision, a significant event. These markings were visible to others, a way of being known even when the body was hidden. Hands and faces were the hardest to protect. Hands were covered with mittens made from fur or hide, often lined with soft rabbit or beaver. These mittens were tied to cords that hung around the neck, so they wouldn't be lost when removed. Faces were shielded with scarves of soft hide or fur, wrapped around the nose and mouth, leaving only the eyes exposed. Even so, frostbite was a constant risk. Noses, cheeks, fingertips, these could freeze in minutes if exposed. People learned to watch each other, to check for the telltale white patches that signaled freezing skin. And when someone came inside from the cold, they did not rush to the fire. That would be dangerous. Frozen skin warmed too quickly could be damaged permanently. Instead, they moved slowly inward, letting their body adjust gradually, warming from the ambient heat of the tipi before approaching the flames. Clothing was not just worn, it was maintained. Hides had to be kept soft and pliable. Furs had to be brushed and cleaned. Tears were mended immediately, because even a small hole could let in deadly cold. And so, wrapped in layers of hide and fur, the people moved through the winter. Not easily. Not comfortably, perhaps. But alive. And when they returned to the tipi at day's end, they peeled away those layers slowly, hanging the robes and shirts near the fire to dry, and settled once more into the warmth. Outside, the wind continued its endless song. Inside, there was only the soft rustle of clothing, and the fire's glow, and the knowledge that tomorrow they would dress again and face the cold once more. Water, in winter, became a puzzle. Not a convenience drawn from a tap or poured from a jug, but a resource that had to be hunted, gathered, melted, and carefully preserved. Because when the temperature dropped below freezing, water disappeared. Rivers became solid. Streams vanished beneath ice. Ponds turned to stone. And yet, water was as necessary as air. The people of the tipi could survive cold, hunger, even injury, but without water they would last only days. So water had to be found. In autumn, before the deep freeze set in, families often moved their camps close to reliable water sources. A river or stream that flowed year-round was ideal, but even these could freeze solid in the harshest winters. When open water was available, it was fetched daily. Imagine the task now, walking through snow to the riverbank, breaking through a thin layer of ice that reformed each night, dipping a hide bag or clay pot into the frigid current, then carrying it back to the tipi with numb hands. The water was so cold it hurt to touch. But it was liquid, and that was what mattered. Inside the tipi, the water was stored in containers near, but not too near, the fire. Too close and it might spill or crack the container. Too far and it would freeze again. Some families kept a pot of water simmering constantly, never letting it cool, so that there was always something to drink or cook with. But when rivers froze completely, another method was needed. Snow. It lay everywhere, piled in drifts, crusted over the ground, clinging to every surface. It was water, technically, but frozen and transformed. Gathering snow was easy. Melting it was harder. because snow is mostly air. A pot packed full of snow, when melted, yields only a few inches of water. To melt enough snow for a family of 6, you needed pot after pot, held over the fire for hours. And melting snow took fuel. Wood or buffalo chips that might have been saved for warmth instead had to be used to create water. It was a constant calculation. How much water did they need versus how much fuel could they spare? Some families dug down through the snow to reach ice beneath, ice from frozen streams or ponds. Ice was denser than snow, and melted into more water, making the effort more efficient. But even this was labor-intensive. Blocks of ice had to be chipped out with stone tools or antler picks, carried back to the teepee, and then melted slowly over the fire. The work was hard and cold, and it fell to everyone, children old enough to walk, adults, elders who could still manage the task. Water, once melted, was never wasted. Every drop was used. Cooking water was saved and reused for washing. Water used to clean hands or tools was given to dogs or poured onto hides that needed softening. There was a saying, or at least a principle, that water was life, and life was not to be poured out carelessly. Drinking enough water in winter was also difficult. The cold suppressed thirst. You could go hours without feeling the need to drink, even as your body slowly dehydrated. Dry air pulled moisture from skin and lungs. Breathing in the cold was like breathing in a desert. Elders and parents reminded children to drink, even when they didn't want to. Warm teas were easier to consume than cold water, and so the fire often held a pot of pine needle tea or sage water, kept warm and ready. Dehydration in winter could be deadly. It weakened the body, made frostbite more likely, clouded thinking. People who didn't drink enough became confused, sluggish, more vulnerable to the cold. And so water, simple, necessary water, became a kind of anchor. It structured the day. Someone always had to tend the melting pot. Someone had to fetch more snow. Someone had to ensure the containers didn't freeze overnight. And in the morning, when you woke with a dry throat and reached for a cup of water, it was not just a drink. It was the effort of many hands. The fuel of the fire. The snow gathered from outside. The ice chipped from the frozen stream. It was survival, distilled into a single sip. Outside, the world was locked in ice. Inside, water simmered gently over the fire, steam rising in soft curls, and someone leaned close to dip a cup into the warmth, and drank deeply, and was grateful. The fire crackled. The teepee breathed. And somewhere in the dark, snow continued to fall, slow and soft and endless. No one survived the winter alone. This was understood, deeply and without question. The cold was too vast. The risks too many. The work too constant. And so the people lived not just in teepees, but in camps, clusters of teepees arranged in circles or loose groupings, close enough to share warmth, labor, and watchfulness. Imagine it now, a winter camp on the plains. 20, 30, perhaps 50 teepees, each glowing faintly in the dusk like small lanterns. Smoke rises from every peak, thin and pale against the darkening sky. Between the teepees, pathways worn smooth by footsteps and sled runners. Children playing in the snow despite the cold, their laughter sharp and clear in the frozen air. This was not just a collection of families. It was a network of survival. When one family's food ran low, another shared. When someone fell ill, others brought medicine or sat with them through the night. When a teepee needed repair, hands came from all directions to help lift hides, replace poles, secure stakes. The camp moved as one. In late autumn, before the deep snows came, everyone traveled together to the winter camp location, usually a sheltered valley or a place with access to water and firewood. The teepees were raised in a single day, everyone working together, and by nightfall the camp was home. Leadership in the camp was informal but real. Elders were listened to, not because they commanded, but because they had survived many winters. Their knowledge was trusted. If they said the weather was turning, people prepared. If they suggested moving the camp, it was considered seriously. Hunters worked together. Winter hunting was difficult. Game was scarce and wary. A lone hunter might track an elk for days and return empty-handed. But a group of hunters, working in coordination, could drive animals toward waiting archers or encircle a herd. And when a hunt succeeded, the meat was shared. Not equally, perhaps. The hunter who made the kill received honor and a larger portion. But no one went hungry if there was food in the camp. The elderly, the sick, the children, they ate. Always. This was not charity. It was logic. A strong community survived. A divided one did not. And so generosity was not a virtue, it was a strategy. Women worked together as well. Hides had to be tanned, a process that required strength, time, and skill. Several women working on a single hide could finish in a day what one woman alone might labor over for a week. They scraped, stretched, softened, talking and singing as they worked. Children learned by watching and helping. A young girl might hold a hide steady while her mother worked. A boy might carry wood for the fire or help pack snow. They were not idle. They were apprentices in survival, absorbing the knowledge they would need to raise their own families one day. Stories, too, were shared. Long winter nights were perfect for storytelling. Elders would speak of the past, of hunts and journeys and lessons learned. These stories were not just entertainment. They were education. A story about a man who ignored the signs of a coming storm and died taught children to watch the sky. A story about a woman who wasted food and later starved taught the value of careful preparation. The stories were repeated year after year, until everyone knew them by heart. But that was the point. They became part of the collective memory, a shared library of survival. Music and games also filled the long evenings. Drums made from hides stretched over wooden frames. Rattles made from gourds or bone. Songs that had been sung for generations, songs of gratitude, hunting, the changing seasons. Children played games that taught skills, games of aim and coordination, games that built strength and reflexes. And through it all, there was laughter. Even in the coldest, hardest winters, there was laughter. Because laughter was warmth, too. It reminded people that they were alive, that they were together, that they would endure. And when someone died, as sometimes happened in winter, the community mourned together. The body was prepared according to tradition. Songs were sung. Offerings were made. And then, life continued. Because it had to. The camp did not dissolve in grief. It tightened. It carried on. And so the winter passed, day by day, tipi by tipi, shared warmth and shared labor and shared hope. Outside, the wind howled across the plains, indifferent and endless. Inside the circle of the camp, fires burned. And the people endured. Together. Winter did not end suddenly. It loosened its grip slowly, reluctantly, like something alive that did not want to let go. The first signs were subtle. A day when the wind felt less sharp. A morning when the sun, though still pale, lingered a little longer in the sky. The snow, which had been dry and powdery for months, began to grow heavy and wet. Inside the teepee, people noticed. The fire did not need to burn quite so constantly. The dew cloth, which had been damp with condensation all winter, began to dry. The air, though still cold, no longer hurt to breathe. Outside, the world began to stir. Rivers that had been locked in ice started to crack, faint lines appearing across the surface, widening into channels of dark, rushing water. Streams trickled to life beneath melting snow. The sound of water, absent for so long, returned like a forgotten song. And then, slowly, the snow began to retreat. First from the southern slopes where the sun hit strongest. Then from the open plains. It shrank into drifts, then patches, then finally disappeared entirely, leaving behind wet, dark earth. The people of the tipi emerged more often. They stood outside longer, faces turned toward the sun. They checked the condition of their tipis, inspecting hides for damage, tightening lashings, airing out bedding. Children ran farther from the camp, their voices bright with relief and energy. And the animals returned. Birds first, dark shapes against the pale sky, geese flying northward in long, ragged lines. Then small creatures, rabbits and ground squirrels, emerging from burrows. And finally, the herds. Buffalo, moving slowly back onto the plains from wherever they had sheltered through the winter. Elk and deer reappearing in the valleys. The hunters watched, and waited, and when the time was right, they rode out. The first successful hunt of spring was a cause for celebration. Fresh meat after months of dried and stored food. The taste of it, rich and warm, was like waking from a long sleep. Feasts were held. Songs were sung. The mood in the camp lifted. But spring was not easy. The melting snow turned the ground to mud. Travel became difficult. Tipis had to be moved to higher ground to avoid flooding. Rivers swollen with runoff were dangerous to cross. And the people were tired. Months of cold and limited food had taken their toll. Illnesses that had been held at bay through winter sometimes took hold in spring, claiming lives just as survival seemed certain. Still, there was hope. Green shoots began to appear in the earth. Wild onions and prairie turnips could be dug again. Fresh plants for medicine and food became available. The camp began to shift, not just physically, but in spirit. Winter had been about endurance, about huddling close and holding on. Spring was about movement, about spreading out, about life expanding again. Families began to talk of where they would go in the coming months. Which hunting grounds? Which rivers? Which places offered the best grazing for horses? The tipis, which had stood in one place for so long, began to come down. Hides were rolled and packed. Poles were bundled. Everything that had been home for months was transformed back into a portable load. And the people moved on. Not all at once. Some families left early, eager to reach new territories. Others lingered, reluctant to leave the place that had sheltered them. But eventually, the winter camp was empty. Only the circles of flattened earth remained, dark rings where the tipis had stood. Ashes from fires. Scraps of hide and bone. Marks in the soil. The wind blew across the abandoned camp, carrying away the last traces of smoke. And the plains returned to silence. But the people, they carried the winter with them. In their memories. In their stories. In the knowledge of how they had survived. They would return to this place again, when the seasons turned, when the cold came back. And they would raise their tipis once more, and light their fires, and endure. Because that is what they had always done. And somewhere, far across the plains, a meadowlark sang. The first true song of spring. And the long winter, finally, gently, came to an end. And so, our journey through the winter tipi comes to a close. You've traveled back in time, stood in the cold, felt the warmth of the fire, and the weight of buffalo robes. You've seen how people lived, not just survived, in a world we can barely imagine. Let these images stay with you now, soft and distant, as you drift toward sleep. The glow of firelight on hide walls. The scent of smoke and earth. The quiet breathing of a family, safe and warm, together. Rest now. Let the cold world fade. And sleep, gently, deeply, knowing that warmth is always waiting. Good night.